Welcome everyone to today's Globe webinar on launching a WTO reform process at MC12, a perspective from emerging economies. We are so happy to see that our audience today is tuning in from all over the world, so thank you so much for joining us. Today we'll be hearing from Ms. Kim Campbell, Professor Fabio Morosini, and Professor James Nedumpara. The webinar will be moderated by Guillaume van der Loo. I am Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, which is our host for today's webinar in partnership with the GLOBE project. GLOBE stands for Global Governance and the European Union, Future Trends and Scenarios. Funded by the European Commission Horizon 2020 program, the GLOBE project seeks to understand the constraints and opportunities for the European Union in promoting its interests and values through global governance. The project provides a state of play in global governance with specific attention to specific issue areas, including global trade governance, in order to identify the major roadblocks to effective and coherent global governance in a multipolar world. Feel free to reach out to us at any point if you want more information on this project. During this webinar, we really want to hear from you, the audience, so please feel free to send questions at any time throughout the webinar. At the bottom of the webinar window, you should find a Q&A button. So please click on that button and send us any questions that you might have, and we'll feed those into the discussion. Today's webinar is the second in our series of a global webinar series on the future of trade governance. Global trade governance consists of many different organizations, institutions, and initiatives, which on the one hand aim to facilitate global trade, and on the other hand aim to integrate non-trade objectives into the global trade governance. These organizations and institutions include the World Trade Organization, which is obviously the subject of today's webinar, but also the G7 and G20, bilateral trade agreements, and unilateral preferential trading schemes, and of course, many private governance initiatives which influence global trade governance, like voluntary sustainability standards and other regulatory approaches. In this webinar series, we want to look at the developments in these institutions and organizations, as well as some of the challenges and opportunities that they face. In the next months, we will organize a series of webinars focusing on these institutions and issues. So please stay tuned for future webinars in this series. Obviously, today's focus is the WTO. And now I hand over to Guillaume, who will introduce the theme and speakers for today. Over to you.
Many thanks, Carrie. I don't know if you can hear me. Perfect. So also on my behalf, welcome to this GLOBE webinar on launching a WTO reform process at MC12, a perspective from emerging economies. Now, this topic is obviously very timely, considering that we only a couple of days before MC12, the WTO Ministerial Conference, which will take place next week in Geneva. And it is today, or this week, it was actually really crunch time for several negotiations on issues that are high on the meeting's agenda. Now, the multilateral trading system, or the WTO, at its center is maybe it's in its deepest crisis since the WTO's creation more than a quarter of a century ago. As we know, increasing trade tensions between key WTO members, the Appellate Body crisis, and the trade-related implications of the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine have actually amplified even more the need to update and reform the WTO. Now, the last couple of months, or actually years, several WTO members or groups of WTO members have made more than 30 submissions on WTO reform, sometimes on specific issues or sometimes more horizontally. The WTO members are expected to launch a WTO reform process at MC12 next week, but it is still today unclear how this could or should look like. And there are still some disagreements on that. Maybe we'll pick this up in a couple of minutes, or address this in a couple of minutes. Now, the WTO debate, or the debate on WTO reform, is very often framed, especially here in Brussels, where I am now, in a transatlantic perspective. Especially here, the focus is very often on the EU and the US when debating or discussing WTO reform, without discussing the positions from emerging or developing countries, although obviously these countries are crucial players in the WTO reform process, as evidenced now the last days and few key negotiations. Emerging economies such as Brazil, India, and South Africa have a different view or views on several important WTO reform issues, and then, for example, the EU and US. For example, in relation to fisheries subsidies, ongoing plurilateral negotiations, the special and differential treatment regime, agriculture, and so on. Now, this webinar will therefore discuss the key priorities and challenges for this WTO reform process from the perspective of Brazil, India, and small and emerging economies. In particular, we will try to identify some of the key differences between this group of countries and how actually the different positions between developing or emerging economies and, for example, the EU and US can be reconciled. Now, we are very fortunate with us to have leading experts from different parts of the world who will give their personal views on the positions of several of these countries. Now, we're very pleased to have Ms. Kim Campbell with us. Kim is currently a trade advisor responsible for trade negotiations and emerging trade issues with the International Trade Policy Section at the Commonwealth Secretariat, based at the Small States Office in Geneva. She provides legal, technical, and policy support to small states with respect to trade negotiations and other trade issues. And she has also previously worked for 9 years as a trade negotiator for South Africa, for the South African government. We also are very pleased to have James Nedumpara with us, who is professor and head of the Center for Trade and Investment Law, established by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry at the Indian Institute for Foreign Trade. James has published widely on international trade issues and has also assisted the government of India in several WTO disputes and advised the government in connection with a number of free trade agreements. And finally, we're also very pleased to have Fabio Morsini, Professor Fabio Morsini with us, who is a professor and associate dean for postgraduate studies at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul School of Law, where he directs the Center for Law, Globalization and Development. He held various positions, academic positions and fellowships all over the world at Michigan Law School, New York University Law School, and has published widely on international trade and investment-related issues, often, but not only, with the focus on Brazil. So I think we have the perfect panel to discuss the subject of concern of today. So I propose that we start with Kim, if you want to kick off, and then we have Fabio and James, and then we immediately open the floor for an interactive discussion. So I already want to flag now that if you already have questions, as Kari mentioned, please don't hesitate to address them or mention them or ask them already now in the dedicated Zoom functions. So Kim, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. And I would like to thank the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies and its Deputy Director, Dr. Axel Mark, and the Globe Project for inviting me to contribute to this very topical webinar today. I'd like to say good afternoon, good morning to everyone around the world, and of course, my distinguished fellow panelists. So as Guillaume mentioned, I'm a trade advisor at the Commonwealth Small States Office in Geneva. We provide trade advice and support to small Commonwealth countries in the context of the WTO and other negotiations. So today I will be speaking in my personal capacity. So all the comments I make are based on information on this issue, which is in the public domain, and not my current or prior affiliations. So with that, my task today is to really set the stage and to cover the key developing country priorities under the 3 pillars of the WTO reform debate, and highlight briefly where the position of developing countries, particularly smaller developing countries, diverge from that of the developed economies, which is the US and the EU. So under the first pillar, dispute settlement and appellate body reform, here, like the majority of members, developing countries support the urgent restoration of a fully functional 2-tier dispute settlement system in the WTO, and most recently, approximately 123 members, developed and developing, have again requested for the 54th time the launch of the selection process for appellate body members be restarted to fill the vacancies as required under the dispute settlement understanding. But publicly, the US continues to oppose this initiative on the grounds of systemic concerns that it still has, its long-standing concerns with how the appellate body functions, particularly appellate body members, which according to them remain unaddressed. But in the last 2 months, informally, the US has been reaching out to select delegations in seemingly good faith attempts to move this DSB process forward. But thus far, these discussions have been very informal and selective, and the scope of this is not that clear. So what are developing countries' priorities? Well, they want to make the dispute settlement system work better for themselves, including LDC. And for smaller developing countries in particular, it's very important to, under this pillar, enable enforcement of remedies that are handed down by the panel and appellate body when it hopefully gets resurrected, and allow equal access to the dispute settlement system, specifically in terms of making it more affordable in terms of costs and easier to use in terms of resources. And the landmark case concerns one of our members at the Commonwealth Small States Office, which is Antigua and Barbuda, who brought a case, as I'm sure you all know, on online gambling against the US, which costs them upwards of $3 million US, and they still don't have a satisfactory remedy. So that kind of highlights the where our members and other developing countries would like to see the direction of reform in the DSP go. And at the same time, most developing countries, including South Africa, India, and the African group, continue to support restoration, as I mentioned, of the two-tier system. And even though not many African countries have been big users of the system to date, it's critical for them to be able to enforce their rights under both existing and future WTO agreements, if so required. And what's more, with the further negotiations currently underway, it's important for countries to be able to enforce their rights in the DSU. Under the second pillar, notification and transparency, as you will be aware, this is really about making the WTO's monitoring system work more expeditiously when it comes to trade policies, and also increasing the transparency of members' trade practices, as well as improving how the committees work. So in this regard, there's been various proposals tabled by developed countries to improve, suggesting ways to improve notification under the various agreements on trading goods, as well as how to make the bodies, different WTO bodies function more expeditiously. And on the position of developing countries really is that the lack of notification on their side and compliance with notification is not so much a result of willful neglect, but rather due to real infrastructure and resource constraints that they face in notifying. And they essentially want to be able to voluntarily identify what technical assistance and capacity building needs they have in this regard. So while they recognize the notification and transparency as an important pillar and fundamental to monitoring trade policies, they don't want to see technical assistance and capacity building that's suggested to be linked to any notification obligations. And they also don't want to see the creation of additional WTO obligations in this regard to add to their burden of compliance, or to the creation of new WTO bodies. And particularly, they don't want to see backtracking from existing rules or the autonomy of regular bodies when it comes to notifications under the various agreements. So another key issue under this pillar is for them to broaden the notion of transparency beyond notifications in specific agreements to cover agreements where they feel developed countries are remiss in their notification, and also for transparency to permeate the entire WTO system, including with regard to how decisions are made. So under the third pillar, which essentially is rulemaking and development, members are debating very critical issues around WTO rulemaking, including how development should be conceptualized within the WTO framework going forward, as well as the legal issues around the negotiating format. So this essentially addresses the what specific issues rulemaking should cover, the who, which developing countries should benefit from flexibilities under special and differential treatment, and who these new rules should apply to, and how future rules will be negotiated in the WTO, given that the multilateral rulemaking system has been stymied for so long on so many issues. So in terms of the what, while developed countries obviously want to focus on the more traditional industrial subsidy state-owned enterprises and state intervention, largely to discipline China, developing countries, and of course modernize the WTO rulemaking function by focusing on current new issues such as trade and environment, sustainability issues, investment, and e-commerce. And developing countries are want to focus attention on the Doha outstanding issues, particularly the implementation issues, and also rebalancing existing WTO agreements where there are they perceived to be structural inequities, including by the G90 proposals, which have been tabled in this negotiating group on development. And also underpinning all this are deep-seated divergences on how development should be conceptualized in the WTO going forward. And in terms of some proposals tabled by India, the African group, as well as South Africa, they basically, to give expression to this, they've sought to bring balance to the development dimension of this debate. And really, primarily, they seek and protected the principle of special and differential treatment as a non-negotiable and treaty-embedded right, including upholding the right of developing countries to self-assess their development status for the purpose of current and future negotiations, rather than it being foisted on them through a priori fixed criteria. And of course, the how will rulemaking going forward take place? So of course, in order to accommodate all these new issues, a lot of developed countries, as we know, have initiated plurilaterals or joint statement initiatives in small group configurations amongst a subset of WTO members. And so as part of the reform process, they're reflecting on ways to create an easier path for these plurilateral agreements to be integrated into the WTO architecture, including amending the very sacrosanct consensus rule under the Marrakesh Agreement. Now, for developing countries and LDCs, by and large, they want to preserve the core principles of the multilateral trading system, including the consensus by decision-making or decision-making by consensus principle. And they've opposed the plurilateral forms of rulemaking for a number of reasons. And I can go into those in detail later, but I see I'm running close to my 8 minutes. And just to finally add that going forward, this is probably going to be the most difficult and fraught discussion, how to integrate these new types of agreement into the WTO, and how this will accommodate different country priorities. And these issues are already being reflected in some of the current discussions, not only in the current negotiations, fisheries, subsidies, etc., but also in the MC12 document, which, as Dylan mentioned, I hope will launch at MC12 a structured process to discuss WTO reform and make recommendations by MC13. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Many thanks, Kim. And while Fabio is setting up his presentation, many thanks. And it's clear, or if I mean, the key takeaways that from what you mentioned is that with regard to the first pillars, the dispute settlement body and transparency there, the focus is very much, as I understand you correctly, on resources and technical support, or the lack of that. But the third basket on rulemaking is a bit more complicated, and I'm sure that we will come back on that on a couple of issues. And let's see to what extent this resonates also with Fabio in the context of a Brazilian perspective, or even a bit broader. So Fabio, the floor is yours.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Guillaume, for this kind invitation. And also like to express my gratitude of being here and sharing this panel with dear friend James and also Kim Campbell. I am speaking on entirely my personal capacity and on my personal interpretation of how things are evolving in the context of WTO negotiations and how it impacts on Brazil, and what are the key points that Brazil is planning to pursue at the MC12. So before I do that, we should all recognize that the world has changed completely since the 1995. The issues, we have new themes, we have new trade practices, new protectionist practices. new players. And in this process, if we look from the perspective of emerging economies, new emerging economies, some of the so-called emerging economies have really emerged, such as the case of China, and others have stagnated, which is the case of Brazil. So this needs to be taken into account, because the position of Brazil is highly impacted by these new tensions within the global trade governance, within the US-China tension. So what Brazil is proposing is to have firm positions in particular matters at the WTO, but it also recognizes that the multipolar order is in grave threat, and for that reason, Brazil has in the past decades also reconsidered its position in relation to trade agreements more broadly, even signing new trade agreements outside of the multilateral trade order. So I will basically give you an idea on the Brazil, before I go into some of the key positions and offensive positions in Brazil. I would like to just briefly go over some of the general characteristics of how the Brazilian trade governance has changed over time, and what might be the drivers of such changes that will certainly impact on how the country positions itself at the WTO, but also at the trade governance more broadly. So I was mentioning about the issue of emerging economies, and that's an interesting graph, because if you know, maybe 10 years ago we're all speaking about these emerging economies. I think that we have now as a truly emerging economy, or even no longer more an emerging economy but established economy, the case of China. But then you also have Brazil, South Africa, and India. And I'm focusing on the Brazilian position, which has been stagnated for several reasons, and of course that plays out in the context of its trade position. Brazil also has changed the trade, let's say the geography of trade that involves Brazil globally has also changed over time, over the past 20 years, and that also needs to be taken into account. And especially I call the attention of China's becoming Brazil's most important trade partner since 2010, and up to this moment, Brazil-Chinese relations account for 32.4% of overall trade involving Brazil, second to the US, which used to be the #1 trading partner, and now is the second with only 10% of trade relations with Brazil. Brazil is stagnating in my perspective in terms of still being this economy that trades primary goods. So we're exporting soybeans, iron, and oil, and we're importing more technological or technology-intensive products, but like fertilizers or human meds, but also oil. Okay, and I was mentioning that in addition to the WTO negotiations that Brazil perceives as being an important platform for negotiation, Brazil has also negotiated other bilateral or FTAs, regional FTAs, negotiating non-tariff issues, given the limitation that it has to negotiate tariff issues within the Mercosur agreement. And one area where Brazil has been very active, and that tackles into one of the plurilateral, is investment facilitation. So that's something I would like to also to explore as we go over this webinar. And I do think that there is an offensive agenda here of Brazil that tackles into what's going on at the investment facilitation agreement at the WTO. I will come back to zoom in. So what I will do within this broader context, Brazil has emitted some of its positions to be negotiated at MC12. And I would like to highlight that perhaps the most important one that has came out recently in the end of May, which is this communication from Brazil on subsidies and public stockholding in food security. So Brazil recognizes that, you know, hunger is a global problem, and I think it takes a different position here from countries like India, where Brazil recognizes food security as an important and emerging issue, but Brazil is trying to differentiate the debate on public stockholding from food security. So instead of giving a carte blanche for all developing countries to pursue subsidies for the purposes of stockholding and food security, Brazil is creating a methodology that's not yet public, which tries to recognize the position of least developed countries and some developing countries, but that needs to follow a particular methodology so that not every developing country will be able to benefit from such flexibility. So I think this is one offensive agenda offensive proposal that Brazil is putting out that distance Brazil from other developing countries such as India and even China, if you do consider it a developing country. Another central pillar of the MC12 concerns fisheries subsidies, and here the position and the sense that I get from Brazil's position is that Brazil is quite flexible in this negotiating theme, and Brazil also believes that it's one aspect of the negotiation where we as the WTO might reach a delivery result in terms of an agreement. So that will be very important in the perspective of what I see from Brazil in terms of legitimizing the WTO as a forum for negotiating trade agreements moving forward. Brazil has also changed or has positions on plurilaterals, and I'll be glad to go over these positions as we move forward. But Brazil has an offensive agenda in terms of investment facilitation for several reasons, but also to lay out that there are other ways of conceiving investment regulation outside of the more BIT standard BIT format, and Brazil has been having experiences with administering investment prevention in the context of the Brazil bilateral relations with other countries, and that is an experience that could be very valuable to the WTO as we move forward in this negotiation. And then also Brazil has been very vocal about digital trade. So the issue of the digital economy, that's probably the most pressing theme as we move forward with trade negotiations, including trade negotiations, and then there is a change in Brazil's position over time that I'm happy to cover, that moves from a more defensive agenda, maybe an agenda closer to the concerns that the European Union has on data governance and digital trade, to a more liberal position after 2018, siding with the US and under the framework of the TPP negotiations for digital trade, and that's quite interesting. And I can explore my hypothesis of why this has happened. Brazil is open to negotiating special and differential treatment, and I think here again it distances Brazil from other developing countries. It has not given up special and differential treatment, but it made clear that it's an item for that is up for negotiation. And that has its context with the OECD accession, or the attempt of Brazil to accede to the OECD, but still an open item for negotiation. And then Brazil has also its position on the TRIPS waiver in relation to the COVID pandemic and ways to move forward. Brazil has taken a more conservative position here in arguing that the existing waiver provisions of the TRIPS could be utilized to address the problems that have been arising in the context of the COVID-19, and also it has a position that if the negotiation needs to move forward in terms of waiver, it needs to be more holistic and not only focused on the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, as Kim Campbell has already mentioned, Brazil supports a functioning appellate body system, so a two-tier system as we used to have, recognizing that some of the concerns voiced by countries like the US need to be addressed, but it is understand that from a developing country perspective, it's the rules-based system is the best way to move forward. So I think I'll end up my opening remarks here, and I'll look forward to hearing from James and to interacting with you all following. Thank you.
Many thanks, Fabio, for this general overview and for this bullet point style on addressing or summarizing Brazil's position on all these key issues that are on the agenda. And it's really interesting that you flagged that on several important issues such as food security, public stock holding, SDT, and for example, the fisheries subsidies, the position is quite different than, for example, India, because obviously Brazil has more, in some areas, offensive trade interests. So I look very much forward to hear James' views on this, on how India stands in all these issues, and specific issues, or I mean, more generally in the debate on WTO form. So please, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Guilherme, and thanks again for providing this opportunity. Let me mention that the usual disclaimer applies, because what I'm going to speak is basically based on my own perceptions, my own specific views on certain issues, and doesn't reflect the views of the government at all. As Kim mentioned, the most important issue on the table is basically the crippling of the appellate body, and we know that for the last maybe 32 months. The WTO appellate body is dysfunctional, and it has got a significant impact on not only the dispute settlement function of the WTO, but on the entire WTO system per se, because without having a proper adjudicative mechanism, without having a proper mechanism for the enforcement of rights and obligations under the agreement, the entire multilateral system cannot actually be sustainable in the long run. So a pressing priority is basically to put the WTO dispute settlement back to function. It is not an easy task. Some of the temporary ad-hoc solutions like the MPA mechanism may be functioning, but it hasn't actually yielded any kind of positive outcome so far. So from India's point of view, India has made proposals way back in November 2018, along with Canada, European Union, Australia, and many of the WTO members, in having a functional dispute settlement body. And that particular, I think, task cannot be underestimated or underscored. It is so important. So when we talk about the WTO reforms, the dispute settlement function is the most important. Then there are other important issues as well. The one approach is definitely the negotiating approach. And the preceding speakers as well spoke about the kind of negotiating approach and modality the WTO has to adopt for the future. And we have got the Marrakesh Agreement, Article 2. Article 3 of the Marrakesh Agreement very clearly states that the WTO shall actually provide the forum for multilateral trade negotiations. And if you look at the history of the multilateral trading system as a whole, we know how the Tokyo Round GATT a la carte system basically created some kind of a fragmentation within the multilateral system, how the developing countries were basically left out of the system for a long period of time. And to that extent, the Uruguay round trade negotiations resulted in having an inclusive organization that talks about including everyone within the scope of the system. So to that extent, can you just give me 1 second? I'm sorry.
No problem.
Sorry about that disturbance. I was getting a phone call in the meantime. So the Uruguay round system basically provided inclusivity, more equitable participation for developing countries within the multilateral trading system. And if we want to have a plurilateral agreement within the WTO, there is already a mechanism provided under the Marrakesh Agreement, which is mentioned in Article 2.2. And if you look at the various provisions of the Marrakesh Agreement, even the WTO members can take a unanimous decision to have a plurilateral agreement. And if you want to make an amendment to the WTO agreement, there is again a provision which is Article 10. So there are mechanisms within the organization in order to have certain kind of a plurilateral agreement with the consensus of all the members. Now the challenge here is that some people say that this organization is not working because the consensus approach has basically broken down. And there's a certain amount of merit in the argument that it is very difficult to have an agreement even on some of this, some of the simplest things. Like even putting back the appellate body, or even in nominating judges to the appellate body, obviously there is lack of consensus. So what can be done in that situation? Obviously, going back to the Tokyo round may not be the best option. So members will have to consider this point when the WTO provides the rulemaking forum for multilateral trade negotiation. To what extent the plurilateral approaches can basically supplant the functioning of the WTO. If there is an agreement among all the countries to have a plurilateral agreement, there is a provision for it already within the WTO system. And that opportunity has to be fully explored. The third important point is with respect to the special and differential mechanism. So we know that special and differential mechanism basically formed the bedrock of the Doha round negotiation. It was actually called the Doha Development Round. So 20 years hence, the negotiation started in 2001. After 20 years, we have only one properly concluded agreement, which is the trade facilitation agreement. And there is a possibility that the negotiations on fish will actually deliver this time. And that is a possibility. But again, when we think about future agreements of the WTO, the one point which Fabio mentioned comes pretty clear to us, that not all emerging economies are actually at the same stage. Some economies have really taken off. Some emerging economies are actually languishing. And most of them are having a kind of a steady performance. So it is fairly difficult to, even to make an argument that all the emerging economies have actually done extremely well and should be considered to have graduated from a developing country to a developed economy. And this is again one of the, I think, if you really look at the history of the GATT, most of the people know why there was a specific part 4 to the GATT, why countries actually started negotiating on the basis of less than full reciprocity. So these are all, I think, if you look at the history of the enabling clause and the developments in the GATT as well as the WTO, huge amount of effort was actually spent by developing countries and the LDCs in order to get a fuller participation in the multilateral trading system. And we also know that the pandemic has actually taught us many lessons. Even some of the fairly well-to-do developing countries experienced grave difficulties during the pandemic. There was loss of employment. Some of the industries became extremely uncompetitive. I think some people lost their jobs. The businesses became unviable during this process. And not every country has actually the financial capability to provide the stimulus packages. So that is why, to an extent, trade preferences, tariff concessions, a longer time period in order to meet the obligations can actually come handy. So it is also very true that some of the special and differential provisions within the existing WTO framework has actually become fairly ineffective in the sense that some of these phase-out periods have already expired. Let me just give one example to you to highlight the importance of having a longer special and differential period within the context of a trade agreement. When India joined the WTO way back in 1995, India did not have a mechanism in order to have product patent. India only provided process patent. And India had to implement or actually carry out the amendments within the patent law to provide for product patent. India required the 10-year period, the transitional period, in order to convince the domestic constituency that there can be a mechanism for accepting or recognizing product patent. So many countries may face difficulty, sometimes in agreeing to or even complying with the trade commitments. And you need a longer period of time, a longer transitional period of time, even to take the support of the domestic constituency. We have to accept the fact that the international trade order is going through a difficult period because most of the countries or most of the political organs actually failed to convince the domestic constituency that trade agreements can actually work effectively for everyone. And when we really look at even the India's and South Africa's proposal for having a TRIPS waiver in the context of vaccine, more than tackling a present situation, it may have ramifications for the future. When we have a global crisis, when everyone has to act together in the interest of humanity in preventing further new mutations to the viruses or in preventing further pandemics or future pandemics, there has to be a collective will. So some of these kind of proposals on the table are not only trying to cover or meet a particular situation or the current COVID-19 pandemic, but it can also provide the platform for tackling some of the crises in the future through a coordinated and cooperative approach. And again, the fish negotiation is a very interesting thing. The one important point which I want to mention here is that some of the challenges that the humanity faces today cannot be located to one particular country. Everyone is in together. But at the same time, some countries need flexibilities. If the approach is going to kick the ladder away, then it can only result in, in the system facing huge amount of reprisal from the people who are left out. So that is why you have to buy in and co-opt some of the stakeholders, even in the developing countries. So sometimes I think these are all areas where negotiation has to happen and we have to act quickly. This WTO Ministerial is happening after 4 years. So we have waited for a long time and now it is the time to deliver. Not only any deal, but a fair deal which can put the trust and faith back in the multilateral trading system. So I will stop here.
Many thanks, James, for your comments and tackling or addressing some of the issues also that Fabio and Kim mentioned. Indeed, you also refer to some of the issues which are now discussed in Geneva, for example, on fisheries subsidies and the provisions on special and differential treatment. I think indeed, there is quite a consensus that, for example, with regard to the fisheries agreements, I mean, SDT provisions are there, but the negotiations are really on the scope of these. No, I think, for example, for India, it has been reported that they're requesting for a transitional period of 25 years. I think this is one of the key outstanding issues, but maybe we can come back on that later on. So actually now I can only invite the audience or the participants to ask some questions. Please keep your questions also short and snappy, and avoid lengthy comments to make it manageable for me and for the speakers. So please go ahead. And while I give the participants some time to formulate their questions, maybe I kick off with maybe a very general question, which goes to the heart of the topic of today, WTO reform and MC12. As you know, we don't know what actually the language will be in we even don't know if you will have a joint statement or what the outcome document will be. But in any case, how to launch the WTO reform process. And even on the general question, we know that there are some differences. It has been reported that India, for example, prefers a quite narrow approach, sticking as much as possible basically to the existing WTO agreements. And obviously other member states find this too narrow and want to have a more broad mandate or agenda for this process. So my question for all three of you is, looking back to your, the countries that you have been discussing, what are really the key priorities for WTO reform? I know this is a general question, but also how should the process look like the next couple of months? How to set an agenda for maybe to have some deliverables by MC13. So what are the priorities and what could or should the process be? A second question, and don't feel obliged to tackle this, but you all three tackled quite in detail the issue of plurilateral agreements. And obviously this is also a crucial, this goes again to at the heart of the discussion on WTO reform. James voiced some concerns on plurilateral agreements, and indeed, several WTO members have concerns on integrating these WTO agreements if they are not a member. So my question is, do you see that maybe, or what kind of principles should be established for plurilateral agreements to be integrated in the WTO framework? You mentioned obviously consensus, but can you go to maybe alternative options that, for example, only a critical mass of WTO members representing a certain percentage or a bulk of trade should be on board before being integrated, or the transparency in the negotiation process? Can you maybe identify some of the principles that would basically make it easier or more acceptable for critical WTO members on this issue to accept more easily plurilateral agreements? So maybe we kick off, and please also feel free to react to each other's comments or maybe specify some of the points that you wanted to mention before. So maybe I give now all three back the floor, and in the meantime I will collect some questions. So maybe Kim, to be sure, now that we know that we still have you here, maybe we start with you again, if that is okay for you.
Thanks very much, Guillaume, for those thought-provoking questions. On your first question, the process going forward, as you rightly point out, the chair of the General Council is, as we speak, consulting with members on what the outcome document should look like, and specifically what a paragraph on WTO reform will state. And as James mentioned, this has been a very sensitive issue, how to word the language on WTO reform, because as you've also mentioned, India would like to see more detailed parameters going into this document in terms of what the WTO reform debate will, the terms of reference around that, what it will encompass, etc. So I think they probably will in the next probably by today, they're very close to agreeing on wording. Another key issue is the forum that this WTO reform package will be debated in. So I think whatever process is adopted going forward, the forum would have to be very inclusive. It would have to be centralized, either within the General Council, either with inputs from the subsidiary bodies. I know that's a big priority for India, to have a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach to this issue, so that the various subsidiary bodies under their respective covered agreement feed into this debate, and in that way, developing countries, especially smaller countries and LDCs, can have an equal seat at the table. And I also think that no issue should be off the table. I think developing countries, however big or small, should be allowed to predefine the WTO reform agenda according to what their priorities are, rather than adhering to perhaps what some bigger, more influential countries would like to see on the agenda. So in that, I think would be my contribution to your first question. And of course, for smaller developing countries who have limited resources, a centralized forum and not splinter debates in different committees would be a priority. In terms of your second question on how to make easier pathways for the plurilaterals, I think this would be a discussion for post MC12 under the work program if it's set up. But definitely, once again, developing countries would have to find a reason to buy into this debate. Again, it's not enough just to have the interests of developed countries, but also developing countries. And of course, it's important, it's difficult to change the rules of the game when you're playing the game. So I think whatever criteria are set up, the integrity of the Marrakesh Agreement, consensus-based principles would have to be respected. And I think, as I said, going forward, ownership, buy-in by developed countries, they have to understand what benefits they're getting out of these plurilateral agreements, whether it's going to be applied on an MFN basis, so that they wouldn't have to actually commit to anything, but they would, such as in the domestic regulation text that's just been finalized at the end of last year, this would apply on an MFN basis to all members, regardless of whether they're party to the plurilateral or not. So that could be a carrot for some developing countries at least to support a consensus approach to integrating these plurilaterals into the multilateral trading system. And as you've mentioned, all the plurilaterals are very open, inclusive, and transparent. So that is one way that developing countries, especially smaller ones, can have a useful, can observe the proceedings, even if they don't formally join them, and then decide for themselves whether or not this is something they want to subscribe to, rather than it having been forced on them. So I think going forward, whatever criteria are adopted, it would have to be really respecting the sovereignty and decision-making of each member, based on how they observe these rules to be developing, whether or not they would like to join these initiatives. And of course, if you're talking about changing the basic structure of the framework of Marrakesh and other WTO framework agreements, this is obviously going to make a lot of countries very uneasy, because then every time someone didn't like something, they could just change the consensus rule or whatever. So I think there would have to be creative approaches adopted going forward, but fundamentally finding buy-in for developing countries in terms of what they would benefit from these plurilaterals. So I'll stop there and let the others make their contributions. Thanks.
Many thanks, Kim. I think maybe we just follow the same order. So Fabio, I don't know which issues you want to address, or other comments that you want to make. Please go ahead.
Great. Okay, so I just saw that there was a question on the chat box that was addressed to me. So it's a question from Vinit, and he's asking whether the position of Brazil of importing high or technology import products, whether this is a policy priority of Brazil, or is it based on market forces? And it's not a policy priority of Brazil. Brazil would love to be able to develop high intensive technology, products, but due to market forces, it has been the case for many years. So, and then I would like to just go back on the process going forward. I think as I sense from the position of Brazil is keen to have the negotiation in the context of the WTO to move forward. Brazil thinks that the fisheries agreement could be the deliverable of this negotiation process, and it also thinks Brazil also is under, I think, as I understand it, the position that we need to negotiate the Appellate Body reform, because that's quite important for the system, and particularly for developing countries that have a trust on the rules-based system. On the plurilaterals, I think that here there is a change in the position of Brazil over the past years. I think in the beginning, Brazil was more keen to negotiate only at the multilateral level, and over the years it has changed its position. So, but I do have a careful note, because for instance, in the context of the WTO investment facilitation, I think it makes a lot of sense for Brazil to negotiate in the way that it's negotiating, because I think it echoes what the country is doing internally and its bilateral relations with other countries. So that plurilateral agreement, I think, makes sense to Brazil. I have doubts in relation to how Brazil is positioning itself in the context of digital trade regulation, and I think it in this particular context, I think that the case of Brazil could be taken, or could be viewed as a cautionary tale, or maybe on how not to proceed, or maybe how not to proceed in the velocity and in the direction that it's going. Because if you compare the position of Brazil in the beginning of the negotiating rounds on investment on digital trade, Brazil was very defensive. It was very aware of the limitations that the country has. Brazil is not a competitive powerhouse in terms of digital trade. So it had a position that was highly informed by how the internet governance internally in the context of Brazil was going on. And with the change of government in Brazil after 2018, Brazil basically let go of this more defensive position that, in my perspective, was in tune with the Brazilian market and the industry and the interest that it had, the protection of data, the protection of consumers, and it opened up for a very liberal model of digital trade regulation that. But personally, I think that it's not the way that Brazil should be going. So I think that works as a cautionary tale for other developing countries. And since I have the floor, I would love to hear James' reactions on the plurilateral involving digital trade. I would love to hear his thoughts on India in this sense.
Right. I think, thank you, Fabio. In fact, India's position with respect to plurilateral is fairly clear and well orchestrated. It is mainly on a principle that the WTO is a multilateral body, member-driven organization, working on a consensus-based approach. Mm-hmm. And the opposition is actually on the ground that even if some issues may require some pressing agreements or some kind of an approach, once we accept this approach, then we'll be walking down, the treacherous path. There's some kind of a reason to it, because once you have started it, then you can actually prevent it. Any country, and now let us actually think about a hard situation. There is a trilateral, statement initiative between Japan, United States, and European Union with respect to market-oriented reforms. It is specifically, I think, targeted at China, or economies which are non-market oriented in the way. Do you think that even some of the current proponents of a joint initiative will actually support that kind of a market-oriented reform as a plurilateral initiative? So that's actually a possible challenge. I think you can have any issue brought into the WTO, and even without having critical mass, you can have an agreement. So the danger is that, I mean, then the WTO can actually go back to the old GATT, where it can become an agreement administering multiple plurilateral agreements. People said that the WTO has become a medieval organization because of the consensus-based approach. Let us be a bit more pragmatic here. Now we are saying that the fish negotiations took 20 years. When we really look at it in a historical perspective, 20 years is nothing. If you look at the GATT, it was mainly dealing with market access related issues. But the modern trade agreements are actually creating rules. So Fabio spoke about digital trade. Some of the issues that we speak about in the context of digital trade can become completely obsolete or outdated within a couple of years. New technology may arise. Or sometimes you may not understand the kind of agreement that you're actually getting into. So there are many issues which need to be properly considered and thought about. And to talk about India, in fact, joined the ITA agreement, assuming that opening up in the ITA sector could be good for India. And down the line, India realized that it was a bad agreement. And there are 2-3 cases actually involved in that, India's ITA commitments under the WTO. To go back to the same old issue, domestic support under agriculture, basically with respect to the calculation, aggregate measurement of support. Of course, I think Fabio has a different take on that matter with respect to the use of peace clause or some kind of a permanent mechanism on food security with respect to public stockholding. But the reality is that the methodology, the calculation methodology in the WTO has been rendered completely useless. You are actually looking at the current prices and comparing with the price that existed in 1986-88 base period. And there could be more than 200%, not 200 actually, 2000% inflation during this particular period in the 3 decades or 4 decades for that matter. So what we agree, I think, trade agreements need to have some kind of a flexibility. Talking from India's point of view as well, I'm not talking about a trade agreement, but about investment treaties. India merely signed around 86 bilateral investment treaties. And when the cases actually started mounting, India had no option but to terminate nearly 75 of these treaties. In the context of multilateral agreements, we don't actually foresee anyone walking out of the multilateral organization or terminating an agreement, right? That doesn't happen. It may happen in the context of a bilateral agreement. So multilateral agreement, by the very nature of its constitution and the structure, they are slow moving. They are absolutely slow moving. And we have to realize that fact. So that is why I said, in the context of the fifth negotiation, if we have reached that particular point in 20 years' time, it is not a bad progress. Because it is actually substantial lawmaking or rulemaking is happening. And if countries want to have more ambition, of course, they have the freedom to have free trade agreements, where 1 or 2 countries can come up with much more comprehensive and detailed or maybe ambitious rulemaking under those agreements. It is happening in mega regionals and bilateral agreements. So I think we have to understand, the fact that WTO is, is not a homogeneous, an organization of members having the same kind of situation, economic development, and other kind of priorities. It represents plurality. And that is why I said plurality requires joint action and consensus rather than some people acting alone.
Many thanks, James, for your comments. And summarizing at the very end, going back to exactly what your view is on the issue on plurilateral agreements. we covered a lot of ground, and I see actually that there is appetite for more debate, because I think we are in an exceptional situation where I see that the number of participants to this webinar is increasing. Which demonstrates that, I mean, we had a very good discussion, but unfortunately our time is limited. And already at this point, we need to stop here. But I'm sure that in the context of GLOBE or other projects that Living Global Governance Center or other or partners here will organize, we will pick up most or some of these issues in future events or projects. So at this point, I can only thank the speakers, Fabio, James, and Kim. Thanks a lot for your observations and for your comments. I think we really have a better view on what the positions are of the countries that we have discussed. Obviously, we will need to zoom in on a couple of these issues in future projects, but I want to thank you also, the participants, for joining. And please keep following GLOBE and GGS, what we are cooking up on this WTO front. And many thanks, and all the best in Geneva or elsewhere. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.